Hi, everyone. This is KJ Johnson with the Illinois Fertilizer and Chemical Association. Hope you're doing well this morning. We have had a lot of calls and questions to the office here in the last couple of months on what EPA has suggested on atrazine regulations. And we thought it would be an opportune time to talk with the membership about this serious issue that EPA has put out on putting the regulations down on what atrazine could be put on. We have two gentlemen that are going to join us today. Greg Krisick is the CEO of Kansas Corn, but he's the co-chairman of the Atrazine Network. We also have Mark White with Syngenta. Mark is the expert on atrazine through Syngenta and has led a bunch of calls on this recently. If they could jump on the call, that'd be great. What IFCA is looking to do is inform our members of how we can reach out to EPA on this. The deadline for comment for the atrazine regulation is October 7th. What our plan is as we'll talk later after this update, is that we are going to have our comments submitted here next week, but then we're also going to ask all members to join in. So what this the biggest part would lowering the part per billion that it could be in water sources. Right now that is 15 parts per billion, and EPA would like to lower that to 3.4 parts per billion. This will affect 70% of the corn acres in the United States. But most importantly, it will affect 100% of the acres of corn acres in Illinois. So Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you and Mark to kind of give an update and lay the groundwork of what EPA is trying to do.
Thank you so much, KJ, and appreciate everyone being with us on the call today, the Zoom and the webinar. I am Greg Krisick, and the Atrazine Network is a coalition of commodity groups, corn, sorghum, sugarcane, fruits and vegetables, at times timber and some other commodities that work on maintaining these products and their availability, since they've become so important to the way farming happens today. And the Atrazine Network has been in existence now probably over 25 years, and you'll see through some of the info that Mark and I will share how long we keep fighting this battle, and it's an important battle, and we will continue to fight hard. We really appreciate our partnership with Syngenta in working on this issue. But you have a slide in front of you that kind of shows the most recent timeline that's occurred, because some of you might say, haven't we already done this? And the answer is, we've done it before, yes, but EPA keeps coming back to it. So as many of you know, pesticide products go through re-registration on a periodic basis. Well, there was a scheduled review began in 2013. And then in 2016, the agency sought comments on a very similar proposal for this 3.4 parts per billion aquatic level of concern and CLOC concentration equivalent. Again, this has to do with their modeling, even though you will hear us talk about how atrazine is probably the most monitored product, pesticide product that's been out there. And we have significantly more information about it not being in the environment compared to many other products, and Mark will probably highlight some of that. In 2016, we had over 30 comments that opposed this, and I'll plant the seed right now today. We need you. I think KJ is going to share how you can comment later, but we need individual comments, because each individual comment, not just check the box and send in a form, but each individual comment with no more than 2 or 3 sentences of how this affects you, your business, or your operation counts in the EPA count to say we have these many opposed. So it's really important. We'll get back to that. After a lot of discussion, after the 2016 process with the agency spanning both the Obama and the Trump administrations, EPA set this level of concern at 15 parts per billion, supported by growers, and I think the registrant as well. We think it could have, and the science would have allowed it to be higher, but after negotiation, we said 15, because it had been, at one point, it had been 10 parts per billion. when they proposed the 3.4. Unfortunately, through a court case where some activist groups have said, and activist groups frequently sue the EPA on re-registration, saying, stop it, don't do it, have the court throw it out. Well, EPA came forward of their own accord and said, we want to re-review this 15 parts per billion. And they came out then in June and proposed the 3.4 when the court said, all right, we'll wait for you to do something. So this is a very unique regulatory way that EPA
Greg, I think your sound went off just for a second.
is addressing this. EPA says the 3.4 always was the number. It's simply not. And so here we are needing to fight them again. Mark, if you go to the next slide. So this process began, and it originally had a September deadline, but then was extended to October the 7th to comment. And there's really two major areas. One is what's a 3.4 aquatic sea lot? Simply put, it's a lot of acronyms and numbers and modeling. But if you tested the water sample from a body of water and it contains over 3.4 parts per billion for these aquatic life standards in that 60-day average, it would be over the limit. But EPA says it will predict the areas they think that are going to have this concern. And you're going to hear from Mark's description how they continue to be very, very conservative in applying their models. We at one point thought this might impact about 23 million acres of corn, sorghum, and sugarcane across the country. And when the proposal came out and you peel back the layers of onion, voila, all of a sudden it covers 65 million acres of corn, sorghum, and sugarcane. So we're talking, and as KJ said, a large percentage across all U.S. corn. More importantly to y'all, the map that you're going to see has 100% of corn acres in Illinois covered by this proposal. Okay, Mark? So there's a long history of the registration and re-registration process dating back to the mid-1990s, which is when the Atrazine network was created. Through these times, there also are what are called scientific reviews or scientific advisory panels to say, you know, let's make decisions here on the best and the current sound science. And that is a big part of what we argue as it relates to the CLOC or the level of concern, because in the past, there have been some SAPs and the scientists say, throw out bad science. And it appears to us EPA never throws out the bad science and keeps using those in their weighted models, the bad studies, and ignore even some very recent or in the last since 2016 timeframes, good science that would clearly weight this to say either 15 parts per billion or even more would be better. So long history there. Mark, next slide. So we will continue to argue on the at CLOC. We're asking for an SAP. That's going on. But Mark is going to explain a lot about the modeling versus monitoring, but also then now EPA is suggesting mitigation practices in the areas that they say would be affected. So really two big components. We're fighting them to get the best science to rule the day, but then we have to recognize what they're trying to propose on mitigation practices, which I think you'll find are very arduous and unworkable. But Mark, take it away from here.
Thanks, Greg. And I think it's important to understand. Go ahead.
Actually, Greg, or Mark and Greg, first, Greg, thank you for your piece. One thing I want to tell panelists or people in the chat, if you do have questions, please type them in the chat box. And then if a question does come up while we're talking, we will get those question answered. So sorry to interrupt you, Mark.
No, not a problem. I just wanted to thank Greg for the good history there. It seems like we've been under some form of registration review or registration process since the early 90s. So, and thanks everyone for being here today. I wanted to go through some of the details of what's driving all of this in terms of the modeling and what the monitoring actually shows, and then get into what the proposed pick list mitigations are. So I've got more detail in the slides than I probably need, so I promise not to bore you too much. I'll get through them as quickly as possible. But what's driving this is the EPA is using the WARP model. It's a watershed model that is used. It was developed by USGS to predict water concentrations for different things, not just atrazine. It can be used to predict, you know, water solution for phosphorus, for example, or nitrogen, or anything that runs off the surface. And the normal output from WARP is a 50th percentile or a median output, the average. And that's what EPA has been giving us since 2016 in their draft ecological risk assessment. However, for this revised interim decision, as Greg mentioned, they've not just been using the median output, they've been using the upper 95th percent prediction intervals. So I'll show you what that looks like in a graph, but it has huge implications for the number of acres that are affected. The other thing they're doing is the CELOC, as Greg mentioned, is 3.4 being proposed. But there's two numbers we're going to look at in terms of the label, the 3.4, but also the 90th percentile of watersheds, or the 90th percent concentration of all watersheds predicted by WARP, which is 9.8. So those turn into your two regulatory numbers on this proposed label. The triangles in this graph represent actual monitoring data from high quality monitoring sites from Syngenta, USGS, and Heidelberg University. Those are the three data sets EPA used to compare and validate their model. The heavy black line is the median output, the normal output from the WARP model. And as you can see, as we do with most data sets, it fits the data nicely, some over, some below, but as it's supposed to do, it's kind of the average. EPA wanted to make sure and try to capture the outliers, the highest concentrations that we reported, in order to be highly conservative. So this top line represents the 95th percent prediction interval that I was talking about. Why is that important? Well, it's easier to see in this bar graph. The blue lines represent the average 60-day 95th percent prediction interval, and the orange bars represent the actual, or excuse me, the max predicted 60 days. So the WARP model would normally, on its average, predict that around 4,300 of the watersheds would exceed this 3.4, and only 1,400 watersheds would exceed 9.8. But when they go to the 95th percent prediction interval, you can see it increases the number of watersheds expected to exceed 3.4, but it wildly exaggerates the number of watersheds expected to exceed 9.8. And it also predicts watersheds to exceed really crazy numbers, greater than 300 parts per billion in some instances. I don't want to confuse you with too many monitoring data sets, but there's several out there. I mentioned this AEMP, which is the Syngenta's required monitoring in many watersheds throughout the Midwest. AEMD not only includes AEMP, but all other monitoring data sets throughout the country that include atrazine. But nevertheless, the blue bars represent actual monitoring data. The orange bars represent the predicted monitoring concentrations from the WARP model. And as you can see, the actual monitoring data represents a pretty good statistical representation across the three different zones. And most of the watersheds we can see in the larger data set are expected to not even approach 3.4, and only a small subset are expected to exceed 9.8. But in both instances, the WARP model wildly exaggerates, again, the number of watersheds expected to exceed the highest number. Now, what does all this mean to you? Well, in Illinois, this means that 100% of all crop acres are affected or expected to at least exceed 3.4. However, 97% of the corn acres are expected by the model to exceed 9.8, the highest tier, which would have the highest tier of mitigation. And again, you know, here's what that looks like, Illinois specific data. down here in the right-hand corner. Again, most of the watersheds exceeding 9.8. And you can look at these box whisker plots. On the left, actual Illinois state monitoring data. On the right, the warp predicted at the upper 95th percent prediction interval. You can see that the warp model is completely outside the bounds, higher than the actual monitoring data. And in the map itself, those represent actual monitoring sites, and you can see most of them are yellow or less than 3.4. There's a few high ones, as expected, in the southern part of the state where runoff is a concern, but certainly not up here. So we do see a big inconsistency between the model and the actual monitoring data. Same thing in Florida. Well, actually the same thing throughout the United States, but in Florida, we don't have any monitoring data that exceeds 9.8. And out of all the monitoring data, we only have one sample that exceeds 4, or that 3.4. However, the model itself is predicting concentrations well over 1,200 parts per billion. Okay, we know there's no runoff from these fields, and what we can see is that the use intensity, the input that EPA is feeding into this model, use intensity for atrazine, is off the charts compared to what the model was actually developed for. The model was developed for 0 to 57 kilograms, and the use intensity in these areas is well over 200 in many points. So, and also the rainfall data, another input factor, is way off. They're talking May, June, but here in Florida, you know, they're 4 months off from when the actual rainfall hits these fields. And finally, just one other area of conservatism. I mentioned the 9.8 is calculated as the 90th percentile of the warp concentration predictions, okay? So you figure, how do you calculate a 90th percentile? You multiply, you know, times 0.9. The reality is 9.8 is actually the 89.5th percentile. And what they did is just round it up to the 90th. So the actual 90th percentile of the data would be 10.8. And I asked EPA, well, why did you do that? Why didn't you use the actual 90th percentile? Why did you use the 89.5? And they said, well, we just rounded up. Well, they rounded up what they're calling it, but they didn't actually round up the number. So, you know, not a big deal, I suppose, but in reality on the maps, this affects 1.5 million corn acres and puts them in the higher tier of mitigation versus the lower tier. So again, here's the map. The blue areas on the map represent all of those acres that are expected by the model to exceed 9.8, the highest level of mitigation. And the pink areas are all those areas expected to exceed 3.4. This is almost the entire corn, sorghum producing areas and sugarcane in the country. As Greg mentioned, 72% of corn acres, 73% of sorghum, and 94% of the sugarcane acres are represented on this map by these colors. And if you want to break out by state, Illinois fares the worst with 100%, and then Iowa at 96%, Missouri at 95%, Ohio at 93%, and you can just go down the list and see how these states are impacted related to their corn acres. So what does this mean on the label? In the revised interim decision, they did propose what would these label mitigations look like. So for all atrazine containing products and across all uses, there's a few rules they'll be implementing. Soil saturation restrictions don't apply to saturated soils. I think that makes sense. But they did prohibit all aerial application. Now, I realize aerial application is not that big for atrazine in the Midwest, but the further south you go, the more important it is. It's also important to note that aerial application does not contribute to runoff. It's not a mitigation. This is aimed at ESA mitigation and by ESA I mean Endangered Species Act mitigation by the agency, and something that really shouldn't apply here. We had also previously added increased setbacks and buffers to the aerial application to be even more safe in our last registration cycle. But they went ahead and prohibited it anyway, or proposed prohibition. The next one is a little harder to wrap our arms around. Don't apply atrazine-containing products during the rain. I think that makes sense. But do not apply atrazine-containing products when a storm event likely to produce runoff from the treated area is forecasted to occur within 48 hours following application. They're basically saying if there's a prediction for a rain event within 48 hours after your application and it could produce runoff, you're not allowed to apply. I don't have access to that good a weather information. Maybe someone can point me in the direction of that, but that's very difficult. Especially, it's hard enough to predict when it's going to rain. It's even harder to predict, is that rain going to produce runoff? So this seems problematic to me. And then also they restricted the total amount of atrazine you can use in any year to 2 pounds, down from 2.5 pounds, which is a 20% reduction. And then for what we're going to talk about next, it's important to know that they divided the states into northern states and southern states, region 1 and 2, and then by watershed, either watersheds greater than 3.4 or greater than 9.8. So keep that in mind as we look at the next slide. So there's the map. Here's an example for a cornfield in region 2, which would be a northern state. So this would apply to Illinois. If you are a northern state and you are in a non-highly erodible field and you want to apply a rate of 0.625 pounds or less, so up to 0.625 pounds, you need to choose from one mitigation practice. If you want to go over 0.625 pounds, you need to use 2 mitigation practices. And regardless, you can't use more than 1.2 pounds in any single application. So the most you can put down using 2 mitigation practices is 1.2 pounds, which would still leave you 0.8 pounds to use in a post application. Now, if you're in the same farm, but your field is highly erodible instead of not highly erodible, all the rates still apply, only now your mitigations are doubled. You need to use 2 for 0.625 or 4 for above 0.625. So keep that in mind when we look at the mitigation list. That's for the worst case scenario for the blue watersheds, or those that are expected to exceed 9.8. For the ones that are in the pink, expected to exceed 3.4, they allow you to use a pound instead of 0.625, but you have to use 1 mitigation. And then above a pound, you need to use 2. And then again, if you're in a highly erodible field, you just double the mitigation. So up to a pound, 2 mitigations, over a pound, 4 mitigations. And the current labeled rate of 1.6 pounds per acre for highly erodible fields still stands, by the way. So you can't use more than 1.6 in these pink watersheds, or the greater than 3.4, if that makes sense. If this seems confusing, that's because it is. Think about trying to manage through this every time you go to a field to spray. Now, if you're in a southern field, which, by the way, Missouri happens to be a southern state. It's the northernmost southern state, but all the states below that are also southern. Everything is the same, except they allow a slightly higher rate for weed resistance management issues. So instead of 0.625, it's 0.8, and instead of 1 pound, it's 1.2 pounds. So that's the main difference between the northern and the southern state. Otherwise, the process in trying to figure out what your rates are is the same. So we've talked about the pick list. What is that pick list? This is the pick list EPA put out. They vetted this with USDA. Most of these practices come from NRCS, and they're backed up by published papers giving effectiveness. But so when it says you would need to pick 1, 2, or 4 practices, it would be 1, 2, or 4 practices from this list. Several of them are what I would call structural practices, like terraces, field borders, grass waterways. And some of them are cultural or management practices like cover crops or strip cropping or contour farming or no-till. But nevertheless, here these are, and you can think through this yourself with fields you're familiar with. How many of these practices are already in place that you could count on, or how many of these practices could you employ newly to use an effective rate of atrazine? We see a lot of issues with these beyond just the cost. The vegetative filter strips need to be between 30 to 100 feet, depending on your soil classification. One practice EPA has included is no pre-emerge application. So where you would normally use a Lexar or an Acuron or a Bicep, after planting, but before emergence of the crop, that would, if you chose that practice, you'd have to wait until the crop was emerged to spray. We can come back to this if there's any questions later. So when we're thinking about this as a company, and I know Greg with the Atrazine Network is thinking about this, the comment period offers an option for us to provide feedback to EPA on maybe other mitigations. In fact, EPA asked if you know of other effective mitigations for keeping atrazine in the field and preventing runoff, please let us know in the comment period, and perhaps we can include them on the mitigation pick list. So the more practices on the pick list, the better, the more farmers have to choose from. So in that vein, some of the ones we've shared with EPA already is when you think of incorporating atrazine, nobody really does that anymore. It's an effective practice, but for a whole host of reasons, including increased soil erosion and decreased effectiveness, soil dilution of the product, we just don't use incorporation anymore. But what if you could incorporate atrazine with a high-speed tool, get the benefits of incorporation, but still maintain the benefits of no-till or conservation till? So we did this research project that found just that, using a Phoenix or a Phillips type harrow to do a quick, shallow incorporation right after application. We still got excellent weed control. We still kept residue on the surface, and we still prevented runoff, much like you would in a conventional incorporation scenario. So, practices like these, if you're aware of any, make EPA aware of those in your comments, if you would. Just click through this real quick. Some of the others that I've noticed in my work in watersheds and working with growers, one of the ones that's most popular in preventing runoff is using split applications of atrazine. So, limiting, maybe half your application to a pre-emerge and then the other half as a planned post-emerge. You get very good weed control that way, but you also significantly reduce the load of atrazine on the field at any one time for any particular rainfall. This is an easy one for growers and retailers to adopt. It's very effective at reducing runoff. We've mentioned this to EPA, and yet I don't know why this did not make it on the application pick list. So again, I know in Iowa they've done a lot of, and Illinois for that matter, constructed wetland work, riparian forest buffers. I know these are not widespread, but where growers do have these practices in place, we'd like to be able to take credit for them because they also do mitigate atrazine runoff. So again, looking at the universe of the possibility of expanding the practices on this pick list would make it easier for label compliance for growers. And then finally, some other things to think about. When we looked into the definition or how EPA defined cover crops, it was the crop must be planted after harvest of the prior year's crop and left in place until field preparation for the current crop. Yes, that would define a cover crop, but it wouldn't define all cover crops because, as many of you know, a lot of people interseed their cover crops into a standing prior year's crop before harvest. So we've pointed out to EPA that when you highly define a practice, you leave out, early adopters or people that are pushing the envelope and trying to get a better stand. And so comments around these areas, what's a normal use pattern for cover crops in your area? Better define the practice from a regional perspective would be very helpful. When we looked into field borders, a lot of fields do have grass field borders. but EPA would require them to be 30 feet wide. And they don't talk about which part of the field border is the most important. And in fact, the most important part of any field border for runoff is the part that intercepts the flow from the field. So again, a further definition there would be helpful. And then we've already talked about the no pre-emergence mitigation practice, but doesn't that drive weed resistance possibly? If we're waiting till weeds are emerged to spray our first application, aren't we already giving them a head start towards resistance versus keeping them from ever emerging from the soil in the first place? And then finally, we're about done, but some other questions that occurred to us are when you're thinking about which practices you can implement, and we talked about structural practices versus cultural practices. Well, according to USDA, about 54% of cropland in the United States is rented. And in most instances, those renters don't have control over what structural practices. They certainly aren't paying for those structural practices like terraces to be installed. So does that not limit many of these practices on the pick list to farmers who are renting versus that are farmer owned? And then the cost of practices. EPA needs to hear from growers on how much it would actually cost to implement these mitigations, because all of them have some costs associated with them. And then finally, who should be defining these practices? Is it EPA, or should we defer to NRCS or the soil and water offices, who are actually the experts in installing these practices with their guidelines? Shouldn't it be good enough if a farmer is in compliance with their soil stewardship plan or conservation plan, aimed at limiting runoff? We would hope that would be adequate enough to use the better labeled rates for atrazine. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Greg to finish up, and certainly we can take time to answer some questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Mark. So for the benefit of the group, as we worked on this through the number of years, sometimes there are individuals who don't think atrazine may not be part, or it's not as clear on the title of the product anymore that atrazine is in there. But even as I've experienced seeing new chemistries come along, atrazine continues to be part of the mix simply because of its effectiveness, and it works. So, we're at a point of over 90 products that do contain atrazine. Just wanted to show you on this slide, the names of all of those. Even if they may be a newer chemistry, you may not realize that atrazine is in there, and how the agency, that being EPA, is going to address this is a bit confusing, but it's widespread. Atrazine's use is widespread in especially the corn products. So wanted you to know that. Next slide, Mark. Our bottom line is wanting to recognize and share with you what we think is going to be the wide-reaching impact of this proposal. In 2016, agriculture, many of you probably responded with comments. We ask you to help us do that again. We've tried to provide you the breadth of what we see in this proposal so that you can make your individual comments and express concerns, we hope. And without these atrazine products, what are the alternatives? What are the costs that farmers are going to incur to be able to have the weed control that they have? And I'll just say at this point, we do try to do a lot of education of the regulators and the influencer community around the fact that there is certainly a strong segment out there trying to reduce carbon in the world, and if we go back to tilling, if we don't have the atrazine products, then the alternatives are much more expensive, and we go back to tilling, carbon will be released from the soil, plus the carbon that will be in the diesel fuel to go across the land to do this. It's confusing. It doesn't make sense to me, for sure. And this format that Mark has been describing, we think is reflective of what the agency is going to try and do on many crop inputs and protection products. And so if we don't stop this precedent here, I think we're going to be living with the challenges in virtually all of the weed control products that we work with and that you work with. Next slide, Mark. So again, I think KJ is going to visit with you a little bit about ways that you can take action. We certainly stand ready to help and support the association in whatever way you want to do it. The Atrazine Network does have some places to go to hook in and get any of this information, but we need these decisions to be science-based and not shifting back and forth. Obviously, our friends at Syngenta, are impacted whenever there's a label change and all of the work and cost that goes with that. And the lower these levels get driven of being able to use the product, then do we think ultimately the efficacy is going to suffer, not only in the short term, but in the long term, will it be seen as not working? And then that lead to even those who want to just totally stop the use of these products, thinking that they have more arguments to say, well, it's not working anyway, you should just ban it. So that's why we need to keep it science focused, science based, and get to the reasonable levels, and recognize that what we're doing, what you're doing with limited to no-till farming out there is working in the sense of modern agriculture, and that this product is very important to fight the weeds as we move forward. So let's go to, I think, the last slide. The Atrazine Network stands ready to help. We have a couple websites, one where you can go to comment if you want. It's called fightepa.com, but I think KJ is going to give you a more localized option. We do have lots of this information about this proposal and about the history of fighting for the trizines at what's called agsense.org, and there are a variety of tools there that if for example you wanted to make available to farmers, your customers, ways to comment as well. There's some postcards in there. There's, again, more electronic ways, but we really ask for your help. Stand ready to answer your questions and provide whatever information that we've been able to gather as we've spent a lot of time on this proposal. And as we get closer to October 7th, we want these thousands of comments to be submitted. So thank you, KJ, and the association for your time and for Mark and my ability to share. We're happy to continue the discussion here as long as there are questions.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Greg and Mark for getting on this call. If you do got a question, please put it in the chat box. I don't see anything right now, but Louise, if there's something coming in, let me know also on that one. I see this as a major issue. The three big things that I see as ag retailers and in the farming community here in Illinois. One is the 48-hour advance. We know in the springtime we are in a packed schedule to get stuff done in a timely manner. And if you look at a forecast when it's planting time, there's usually 3 days out of the 7 days, there's at least some kind of chance of rain out there. So that is a major concern. We are fully back, and we just had a 4-hour field day yesterday talking about what the 4-hour fertilizer means, but also conservation, tillage, stuff like that. This is going to directly affect that also. So it's a big thing. But one of the biggest things is I know Illinois is a huge pre-emergence for atrazine. If they're going to limit that also, that's taking another tool out of that toolbox at the end of the day. So this is why I wanted to get Greg, Mark on the line to kind of inform our members, and we're going to have this for members to re-listen to so you can pass it on to your membership or your company, people in your company. But what we are planning to do is IFCA is going to have comments ready next week. We're going to resend that out to membership. We're going to probably send this video, this recording of this video also to membership. If you would like to go to Fight EPA today and submit comments, we'd love to do that. But we will also have a link through the email that we send out, and you can pass it along through your guys' companies to write comments. Now, usually we'll have a general manager or the plant manager write comments, but this is so important. I cannot stress that. This is so important. if it takes 1 or 2 lines for somebody that's in that rig of that sprayer or just in that office, please submit these comments. Because like Greg and Mark has already said, if EPA puts the limit as this right now, this is what's going to go on other products going forward and forward and forward. This is why this fight needs to happen today. So again, I'll leave it for just one more second to open up questions. We don't got anything right now, unless Louise, I'm not seeing it. I just want to appreciate you guys getting on this call. If you guys have more questions or concerns, please always reach me at kj@ifca.com or call the office at 309-827-2774, and we'll try and answer. Again, deadline for comments are October 7th, but please get those in sooner. Again,
KJ,
questions?
yeah,
Who's on? Yep,
KJ,
Dave.
this is David Flackney, and I just I know many of your members, and I just wanted to make kind of just a summary comment if I could.
Yep.
As everybody stressed the importance of this, you know, you think about a corn soybean rotation, which makes up the majority of Illinois production. And, you know, if we lose the effectiveness of atrazine on the corn side, what does that do to the ability to manage weed resistance when you have it in soybeans? You know, it's bigger than just one product, but this is one of the most important products we have in our toolbox to manage weed resistance and get effective weed control in corn. You know, so what Mark and Greg shared is, you know, one, the science does not support lowering this number. We have to tell the agency, you know, stick to sound science. Two, the model over exaggerates reality. We know the monitoring does not ever result in these levels at the scale that the agency's trying to say their model would be. So again, get the science right. The model's way out of whack. And then, you know, you guys can be the ones that can speak about the importance of this tool to your customers in a no-till situation, the importance of, you know, how you use it, why you use it, and how critical it is in weed resistance management. All of those little narratives, and it doesn't have to be long comments, but if you can put some narrative around why this product is so important to Illinois agriculture, and that what the agency's proposing is so out of touch with reality in terms of what the monitoring shows, and that this is unnecessary if they stick to sound science, that is a message they need to hear from as many people as possible. So appreciate you letting me just kind of summarize that at the end, KJ.
No, I totally agree. I think this is so important, because if this gets through without us commenting or, you know, not putting a fight up, this is what's going to go on other products into the future. And like Greg had put out, or Mark had put the slide, go look at how many products have atrazine in it. And I'll argue that probably the vast majority of a pre-emerge in corn has one of those products in it. So guys, it is super important, because atrazine is a little bit of everything, especially on corn pre-emerge products. If there's nothing else, I'll give you guys your guys' time back. I appreciate it. Or Mark, I'll let you, got one question.
I just wanted to say one thing real quick. Greg mentioned that EPA is really looking at this pick list approach as a path forward for many other herbicides in the future. And that is true. And atrazine actually wasn't the first. The new Enlist and Enlist Duo labels have this pick list approach. So if you want to see what that actually looks like on a label, go try to find one of the new Enlist or Enlist Duo labels, because they've done it there. They're proposing it for atrazine, and I know they're going to use this as an approach down the road to help mitigate endangered species issues. So it is real.
I guess I got one question for Mark or Greg or Dave. I'll let you answer in. On that pick list, it does say pre-emerge. So what are guys that are no-tilling? You know, we're trying to push more of a conservation type practices. It's in direct contrast of what maybe another NRCS is saying through USDA, that we want guys to switch to that type of farming. I mean, it's kind of contradictory of what they're trying to say with each other. How does a farmer, how does a retail deal with that?
So it's a little complicated, because when it says no pre-emergence, what that is a mitigation practice. You don't have to choose no pre-emerge. You can still do pre-emerge. And in fact, I would argue if you're going to no-till, you have to do pre-emerge, because you're going to do a burn down and you're going to add your pre-emerge with that, right? So really what that does is limit your options. So you can't choose no pre-emerge and no-till. So there you go. That takes one off the list of mitigations that you can choose from. Because keep in mind, on many of these rates, you need to choose 2 or 4. In some cases 1. But if you need to choose 2, okay, no-till is 1, and you can't choose no pre-emerge. So what's the other one you're going to choose? You can't choose incorporation. You may not have terraces or contour farming or vegetative filter strips, so you're left with cover crops maybe. I mean, you need to think through these scenarios. If I'm in a no-till scenario, how does that limit the other practices I can choose? And if I do choose pre-emerge, no pre-emerge, then I'm likely not in a no-till system, or probably even a conservation tillage system. So think about how these go together or don't go together when you're thinking about, if I have to choose 4, how many, in the real world, how many options do I really have? Because it's not all 12.
Yeah, I agree.
And KJ, you're exactly right in terms of this being contrary to the administration's whole push right now, which is climate smart ag, which includes no-till, which includes a lot of these other practices. But it's, if atrazine's not effective because they've driven the rates too low, and so a grower can't do effective no-till, can't control the weeds without tillage, will growers go back to more tillage because their hands are tied? And that's been a message that we've shared. It's something that your members can say, if we can't use, if we don't have enough pick list options and we can't use atrazine effectively, growers are going to go back to tillage. That's a message the agency needs to hear, because they need to understand that this could have some serious implications if they don't get the science right and get the number right. And let's remember, if the number stayed at 15, which is still highly conservative, none of this would be necessary. So we need to really share with them the negative implications from what they're proposing here.
And also, let's keep in mind what EPA is really proposing here. Yes, they give you pick lists, but in many cases you have to use 2 or 4 to use that higher rate of atrazine, depending on your field. And what we don't have a good sense of is how many growers are going to choose extra mitigations to use that higher rate. I don't know that. We probably won't know that until we go through a season or 2. But I think what EPA is banking on is it's just going to drive the rates lower to that 0.625, because that's the easiest path forward. I pick one mitigation, I use 0.625, and I'm done. So the reality is we're really looking at reduced rates well below £1 in most cases, unless there's growers out there that already have practices in place that can already check the box. So it might be helpful when you're commenting to say, this is what would affect me on my farm, or how I would use it in my field. I would have to go towards or gravitate towards the lower rate versus extra mitigations to use a higher rate.
Well, gentlemen, I really do appreciate your guys' time. Again, look forward to putting some stuff out next week to our membership. Again, if you guys got any questions about this, please email me, kj@ifca.com, or go to ifca.com, our website, or you can always reach us at 309-827-2774. Guys, I really appreciate it. We look forward. Again, the deadline for comments to EPA is October 7th. You can go to Fight EPA. Do I correct on that website, Greg?
Yep.
Or we'll have a link to what we send out to membership. But again, Would love to see people who come up, but even people in your guys, the sprayer operators, stuff like that. We need every comment we can to push back on this. So again, thank you guys very much. We will see you guys soon. Have a safe harvest.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.